So today, it's back in the news, kind of went away for a while. I absolutely do believe that the COVID-19 death count is inflated. I agree with a lot of experts who say that's the case. I think it's pretty hard to argue for the 110 to 120,000 number total that's being cited out there. If you disagree with me, you're more than welcome to change my mind.
Okay, so what numbers do you think it actually is?
Yeah, well, first off, let me ask you, do you agree with that number, that general total that's being given out?
Yeah, okay. More or less.
Yeah, I think it's at least 25% inflated. Let's go through a couple of instances. So in New York, 25% of all COVID-listed deaths were never tested at all.
Right.
Did you know that?
Yep.
They were never tested, just listed as guessed COVID-19. Then are you aware of what happened in Colorado? And by the way, none of these are trick questions. A lot of people aren't necessarily aware of these. Are you aware of what happened in Colorado?
Not offhand, go ahead.
In Colorado, they said we need more accurate data because this is much like New York. Everyone who dies who has COVID in their system just lists as a COVID death. That doesn't really help us get a good picture of what's going on.
Right.
So they separated death from COVID. They separated that from death with COVID, where people happen to die with it in their system.
Right.
The number of deaths dropped by, take a guess.
25%?
About 25%. Then all nursing home deaths were listed as COVID-19 deaths, despite the fact that 25% of all deaths in any given month come from nursing home patients because they're very old. Someone hit by a car who has COVID in their system, is it a COVID death?
I've heard cases of that. Have they actually filed them as COVID deaths?
Yeah. Let me give you a very specific, let me use another hypothetical, because I think this matters when you look at these numbers. Let's say I try and kill myself. Bunch of pills, put a gun to my head, whatever it is. Take a very effective method of attempting suicide. I'm close, but no cigar. So I get put in the hospital, right, and basically put on life support. They're trying to help me survive, and I don't make it, and just before I die from my suicide, I get COVID-19. Is that a COVID death?
No, and I would think it would be one of these few outliers too. Does that
That is literally a COVID death right now.
But would that add up to 25%?
Well, it's tough to know because 25% of the deaths are never tested. So here's what we do know. 25% of the deaths are never tested. Anywhere we've said, let's separate death from, let's separate that from death with COVID, we remove 25% off the bat. Anytime we look at a lot of these individual cases where we see these people who died with COVID, there are a lot of complications. Texas, I don't know if you're a Texas native, if you're California yourself.
Yep.
The first Texas COVID death, do you know what it was? The first one registered as a COVID death.
Not offhand, actually.
And it's not a trick question because I was surprised. How old do you think the guy was?
I don't know, 60.
97 years old with a severe underlying condition. And I couldn't find the exact underlying condition because I don't necessarily have access to all the medical reports. I would think that one of the underlying conditions is being 97.
Yeah, that'll do it.
So when you look at the numbers and you say this reduces it by 25%, the average age of COVID patient death is older than life expectancy in states like New York. And for example, in New York, there was a policy where nursing homes had to take in, this COVID patients, which, listen, while the last gentleman was talking about compassion, that to me is just an absolute nightmare. It's a buzzsaw where you take nursing homes and force them to take in sick patients from the hospital that should be equipped to deal with them to a nursing home where they're not able to deal with them. We know that they're most at risk. If you take away just those, just the ones that aren't tested, just the litmus tests that are used like in Colorado, and just the old folks home deaths in New York, you've reduced that number by many, many, many tens of thousands, right? And I think we both agreed that those should not be counted as COVID deaths. The ones that I mentioned, the attempted suicide, being hit by a car.
Sure, I don't
maybe
know.
Maybe a 97-year-old who's in hospice. So we need to be...
He'd be cuspy. I think the suicides and stuff would be good, but I don't know if they'd be 25%, maybe 5 or 10.
Well, 25% aren't tested at all. So we don't know at all about those 25%. And of the remaining ones where we do have reports, there are a lot of cases like this, right?
Right, and of those other ones too, there's the opposite. I'm sorry.
Oops, sorry, that's no problem.
Where they had some sort of symptoms, heart failure, lung, pneumonia, that sort of thing, but they didn't get tested. So it could have been the other way around, where they did have corona. We just figured it was a regular.
It's very unlikely. And
yeah, they are sampling it more towards the side of.
Would we agree that's because I just had a wife who was in the hospital for a long, and the very first thing they did was test her for COVID and meet a visitor. So would we both agree that if someone is going into the hospital, really at any point this year, they are far more likely to be immediately tested for COVID than for pneumonia?
Yeah, probably true.
So I think we would both agree that if you're going to weigh that, the scales would tip in the balance of they're over-testing for corona. That's why we have more cases now, even though deaths are going down, right? Cases are going up, but deaths are going down. And so I think if you take all these things into account, the idea of the stringent lockdowns and that you're anti-science if you don't 100% agree with it, that's a real problem for me. And the idea that if you don't listen to people who say 2 million lockstep, well, you don't listen to the experts. Well, there are a lot of experts who said it wasn't going to be 2 million, and it turns out they were right.
Yeah, and on the other hand, if you look at China aside, East Asian countries have actually been pretty good as far as cases.
Well, they also basically doxed their own citizens, like in South Korea. So the contact tracing was very severe. Where not only do they show, but they show the public where these people are who may have coronavirus. And again, that does come into, in the United States, are we willing to give up our civil liberties where anyone in our block should know our goings on because we may have tested positive. I'm not willing to give up that liberty for a disease that, again, I believe is being dramatically overcounted as far as death totals.
Yeah, that gets pretty dicey pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Like, I work in cybersecurity, and I can think of all sorts of bad things you can do with that.
Yeah, no, exactly. Once you give that up, you never get it back. All right, what's your name? Paul?
Paul, yeah.
Paul, thank you so much, Paul, for sitting down, brother. I hope it was productive. It was helpful. Thank you, man.
Watch Louder with Crowder live, Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern.